or maybe he's still trying to get his Zoom in order.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you,
Yay.
Ben.
This has been a truly traumatic, like 20 minutes. I'm zooming you from my phone because I could not get my computer to zoom it. I'm so sorry. I am one of the recalcitrant nerds who insists on continuing to use Linux, even though everyone else has abandoned it. And I use Zoom every day with no trouble, but I was told by your system that I needed to upgrade my Zoom. And so I've spent the last 20 minutes trying to upgrade my Zoom. It was so hard.
Oh,
And so I know. So now I have Zoomed you from my phone, which is probably what I should have done in the first place. And so I'm really sorry. Thank you for your patience with me.
oh, no worries, Ben. We are so
Welcome.
thrilled to have you here.
Mhm.
I just wanted to give you a little bit of a a preview of what's been going on prior to you arriving. This event started on Wednesday, and it's a humanitarian Mapathon event. And the goal was to digitize 20,000 buildings using hot OSM and OpenStreetMaps. I don't know if you can see from my virtual background, but between our two campuses, UCLA and USC, we each digitized collectively 10,000 buildings at each school. So we reached our milestone of 20,000 buildings, which were digitized. Mostly we were working in Indonesia and Sudan, South Sudan. And then yesterday we had back-to-back workshops around topics of humanitarian mapping, data science, Python, Jupyter Notebooks, Tableau, QGIS, all these kind of tools that I know you're familiar with the work that you do and the team that you manage. So we're all very excited to have you here. I just wanted to quickly kind of introduce you with the work that I know that you've done. So let me just quickly, just very briefly share my screen. So you look quite different from your picture here.
Yeah, COVID's been hard on us all.
Yeah, you have this kind of rock star vibe about you today. COVID has made us all into punk stars. But Ben, if you're from Los Angeles and are familiar with the type of work that the LA Times has done over the years, we know Ben as this kind of data and data journalist who has put together a lot of the data, journalistic stories around the LA Times and our local communities. I happen to, know about Ben's work primarily through the pandemic, because when this came about, tracking the coronavirus in California was a site launched by the LA Times earlier this year. And Ben led the effort to work with community organizers, with hospitals, to kind of have a one-stop shop where all this information about the coronavirus was collected. It's really an amazing resource if you haven't been there. It has all the almost real-time data statistics about coronavirus, kind of more focused locally. So we know we have data from Johns Hopkins that's global and kind of more national, but where do we find neighborhood level data about what's going on in Los Angeles? And this is just an incredible resource. It's full of real-time data, graphics that's updated hourly. Unfortunately, it's still relevant today. Back in March, when I first talked to Ben about this, I was actually thinking, maybe it'll last till the summer. But that's the reality of the moment. It's an incredible resource with data, charts, maps. And also, what makes this resource so useful for us in academia is that Ben's a huge, as he said, Linux operating systems, about open data. So, this week we've been thinking so much about open data, crowdsourced information, using OpenStreetMaps. And the data desk information provided by the LA Times allows us to really work with data that's transparent, that's made publicly available. And this coronavirus GitHub page is where I believe Ben's team is contributing to the community by providing almost real-time data and statistics about all the information that they're collecting. So I'll leave my talk to that and let Ben take over now. And once again,
Sure.
thank you, Ben, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. I had just emailed you a link to my deck. So I'm stuck on my phone. Would you mind calling that up and just sharing your screen if it's not too much hassle?
Oh, no problem. Hold on 1 second.
Sure. I'll spiel for, I don't know, not too long, but I was hoping to give everybody here an overview of our team at the LA Times, the data and graphics department, kind of what we do, the types of people who are on the team, the types of things we make, so you guys could get a sense of, you know, how these kind of data skills live within the journalism world. And then we can answer any questions anybody has or really talk about anything you guys want to talk about. And along the way, if you have anything you want to know more about, or if I'm not explaining something good, just stop me, just talk. I'm happy to have a conversation, and glad to be here. So I also think it's really cool you guys are doing OpenStreetMap stuff, which I myself have dabbled in a little bit, trying to do one of my hometowns in Eastern Iowa where I grew up. So, well, where to begin? So my name is Ben Welsh. I'm the editor of the Data and Graphics Department at the LA Times. And we're a team of about 20 people who try to use our computer skills to like make stuff happen. And this presentation will give you kind of an overview of what that ends up being. So go ahead and click on. So there's me before COVID. My wife calls this my Bible salesman photo. And obviously next is me after COVID. We already got to this joke though, so we don't need to stick with it. Shout out to all the Twin Peaks fans out there. We can keep going. And this deck is one that I have presented internally at our company, and it initially included some private business figures, which I've redacted just to not get in trouble. But I'll give you the gist of what I was trying to get across when we get to that point, okay? Keep clicking. So the Data and Graphics Department, its mission, as best as I can articulate it, is for us to create digital journalism that's important to the readers of the LA Times, both in what they want to read and what they ought to read, right? With using data, development, and design. And by development, I mean actual computer code development, right? So the people that are on this team, if you hit the next slide, are not just reporters and editors and journalists and, you know, people like me who went to journalism school. They're also at the same time computer programmers, data analysts, information designers, data scientists, whatever you want to call it. They're nerds, right? And so we're kind of one of the more multi-hyphenate teams at the LA Times, and that people are called upon to not just do the traditional skills of journalism, but also to have these technical skills that let them find and tell stories in other ways. And this is something that's increasingly common across the journalism industry. Our team is not unique. There's kind of an evolution happening in graphics and data departments across the country where graphics is becoming kind of a higher skill data and programming profession. And our team is kind of is caught in the same currents that are driving that, right? And so the people on our team have to be pretty darn flexible. And so if you hit the next slide, you can get a look at them. Like I said, it's about 20 different people. They come from, many of them from Southern California, many of them from UCLA and USC, or at least a couple, but also from all across America. And they're people with a lot of different backgrounds and skills. We try to have everybody, you know, learn as many of the different types of things we do as possible. But, you know, the way it works out is some people tend to be a little better at analysis or maybe a little better at visualization. But we don't specialize. We really do kind of try to treat everybody as being able to take on all of the challenges. And so we're always learning and we're always experimenting and trying to take on new skills. Just this morning, I was helping someone learn how to write some Svelte, if anybody here is a Svelte fan, to make some of our election graphics for next week. So if you hit the next slide, we're going to get into what are these things we actually make. You know, in a lot of ways, to me, a newspaper, where I've worked at the LA Times for 13 years now and seen a lot of change, but, you know, even though we're making different things and different products, it is kind of an information factory. You know, in a certain sense, a news organization takes the raw materials of like life, of things that are happening in the world, and it refines those raw materials into products, you know, news products that you can sell and the people want, that help them make sense of the world. And traditionally, you know, in my painful metaphor, you know what I mean, the assembly lines at this factory were really focused on making a print newspaper that had blocks of text, right, with headlines and photos. And that was like, you know, what the majority of the assembly lines were set up to do. There were other ones to have sports scores and boxes and to give you the movie listings and all these other things. But in the rewiring of our economy that's, you know, brought on by the internet and all that, the factory of the LA Times has to be refitted with new assembly lines to make different products, right, that are more in line with what people want, that can compete with other factories out there in the marketplace, and that can help us shift to a different type of business, which is more focused on getting money from subscriptions and readers who like us enough to pay us, and less so on advertising. Which, if you guys are interested in all that business stuff, we can talk about it later, but I won't be too boring. And in our little department, it's my view that our assembly, we basically have 3 assembly lines that are the people you saw before kind of interchangeably work on. The first one makes applications, you know, software, websites, right? The second makes visual stories. These are standard, we'll get to those. And then the third is making digital designs. And so let's go through those 1, 2, 3, and I'll show you a bunch of examples of each. So first up is applications. This is where we use our software skills to gather and refine data to serve our digital audience, writing computer code to go get data, filing public records requests to get it, otherwise building databases ourselves from the ground up that we can then turn into a web application that is not a traditional story that people will want to read and maybe even pay for, right? And so if you hit the next slide, the first example, I guess, would be the coronavirus tracker. This is a recent one. This is where we're gathering data from a ton of different sources and turning it into all these pages that update as frequently as we can get them to, and let people slice and dice and tailor them. There's also 58 pages, one for each local county, right? And we're always working to look and expand on this. There's a few things I'm hoping we can get out soon. Yes, that is Netscape. This is my visual pun for this presentation, if you'll bear with me. I'm showing my age. Okay, so then like another example, if we keep going, would be our live wildfires map. So this is where we're pulling in data from a lot of public sources and one private one to try to give people the most comprehensive kind of composite view of what's happening with wildfires this minute in California, or the most recent one possible. And it's in no way a traditional story, right? It's a single web page that updates and stands alone. If you hit the next one, another example would be our QuakeBot. So this is something that isn't like a standalone web page. It's something else. It's a piece of automation. And so every time there's an earthquake detected by the USGS, it sends out like a data feed to the whole world, like kind of little pulses that say, here's the latest earthquake and how big it was and where it was. And we have an algorithm that reads every one of those based on how close they are to Los Angeles and how high the magnitude is. We have some sort of editorial barriers. And then if the data surpasses those barriers, this blog post is automatically written and this map is automatically made and prepared for publication. And so within a minute of an earthquake happening, we can have the complete post, including the map, ready to roll. We still have a human look at it, of course, before it goes live, but this is where automation gives us kind of a quick step out the door immediately. And then the next one would be, I think, our most recent police shootings database. We have a long-running project called the Homicide Report, where we have built from the ground up our own independent database of every person killed by another in LA County since the year 2000. And this year we decided to repurpose a slice of that data to be a standalone database that just tracks police shootings and gives people a sense of the latest trends. And that now, like the homicide report, live updates every time we get new records in. These databases, they power these standalone applications, and they would probably be worth doing just for that reason. But they also have the side benefit of allowing us to do enterprise analysis into these issues that we otherwise couldn't do if we didn't have the data, right? So on the next slide, you can see, since we've been gathering all this COVID data for months and months, we've been able to do tons of stories about COVID that are a little more traditional, but that have stronger claims and more insightful analysis because we have this data to draw from. So one example would be this kind of step back piece that we did after LA County's sort of botched reopening, where we were able to use all the data we gathered and other things we pulled in to kind of to tell that story of what happened here in LA in a way that wasn't just a data application, right? And then the next one would come from our homicide report database. If you guys follow the news, you may have heard about the case of Dijon Kizzee, who was a young man killed following a bicycle stop in South LA by sheriff's deputies. And when that happened, it sort of raised a question of, well, how common are these bicycle stops that lead to fatal encounters? And because we had gathered this database and had all this information, we were the only media outlet that was able to give the public, the news that, hey, this isn't a lone incident. This is something that's happened 15 times in the last 15 years. And so it's not especially common, but it's more common than this being the first time, and you're able to bring context and insight to it. You can see, if you see that map fly by really quick, that these incidents have been concentrated in certain areas too. We have some public records requests out that I believe will allow us to look into that further in the future. So that's thing one. That's the kind of the applications and the analysis. We have live election results coming on Tuesday. So this is all the flowing data feeds of votes coming in from across America. We'll go into maps and tables and charts to help you kind of make sense of what's going on, right? And so, all right, so now we can do thing two. So assembly line number 2 is visual stories, is what I call them. This is kind of an emerging story type in the world of data and graphics online that nobody really has a good name for. So if anybody here has a better name for it, I'd love to hear it. You can hit the next slide. And so visual stories are when a graphics reporter reports and designs visual coverage that is substantial enough to stand on its own. Traditionally, graphics departments had sort of made accompanying graphics. So on the old assembly line, you might be making a front page story, and you got to have 1,600 words of text, and you got to have a headline, and you got to have maybe a couple photos. And hey, if you're really going to dress up that front page story, you might get a bar chart to go with it, right? And so a lot of graphics departments had been oriented around being a support desk that was producing these sort of supplementary graphics for traditional stories. And we love those graphics. They're a good thing. I like them. But I think we have the potential to do quite a bit more. And I think our audience wants something a little more. And so one thing I bet everybody here has noticed reading some of the leading news outlets in America is that they now produce these visual stories that are primarily just a combination of graphics that are big enough that they can just stand on their own, right? And that's what I call a visual story. And these are pieces that at most places are reported, pitched, and executed primarily by the graphics reporter. It's not a case where a writer of a traditional story comes to the graphics department and asks for a graphic, right? So the entire process of how things kind of come together has changed. And the graphics reporter is more in the driver's seat, okay? And so go ahead and hit the next slide and we'll look at some examples. So earlier this year, as I'm sure everyone here knows, Kobe Bryant died in a tragic helicopter accident near Calabasas. And immediately we thought there's a visual component to the story. For people to understand what happened, you need to know the path of his helicopter, right? And so on day one, it was like a map of where did he crash, and it's just like an X. And then on day 1.5, between day 1 and day 2, it's like, well, what was the path of the helicopter, and what was really going on, and what's the play-by-play, right? And then what we kind of learned it happened on a Sunday. What we kind of learned on Monday is like, oh, well, it seems like the final part of this helicopter flight is where things really went wrong. And this was kind of the crucial moment. And so we decide, well, let's try to do a story that helps people see or understand as best as we can what happened. And so we took the publicly available data about the helicopter and we turned it into like a 3 or 4 step little graphic here that has, for each chapter in the story, has like a 3D map that helps you see what's going on. And by the end, you sort of are able to see this sort of important thing where the helicopter began climbing very rapidly in the last few seconds before a quick turn and then a crash. And that's the sort of thing that you can describe in words, but is maybe better understood by seeing a 3D model, right? So the next example on the next slide would be, something from politics. So we have this very tight DA race, we think. And after the primary, when we knew we were going to a runoff, we get the precinct level results that show you where people voted in every neighborhood. And we kind of did an analysis that looked at, well, where is the incumbent strong? Where is the challenger strong? And what would an upset coalition have to look like based on past election results and what we kind of know about this election? So this piece is really about helping people understand the political calculus of this local race through maps, right? And then the next one is we did a local mask survey. So there was this thing over the summer, the question of how many people are actually really wearing masks. And rather than just quote public opinion polls or take data from other places, we decided to conduct our own survey. So a dozen of our reporters went to 3 different locations multiple times over a few weeks. We followed a method that Jill Darling at USC helped us figure out. And then we were able to kind of come back with our own provisional conclusions about how many people are wearing masks roughly and the variations between the different locations we looked at. And then that's presented here as sort of a designy standalone thing that's really more about charts and maps than it is about text, right? The next slide would be something that's not really data at all. It's more visual. And so in the George Floyd protests, I'm sure everyone saw on social media, there was a lot of footage of the police here in LA being pretty violent. And so we did a piece where we tried to aggregate as much as that as possible and then help compare it to the actual standards for use of force that police are supposed to follow to show the contrast. And so this is a case where we're using the design and the visual graph and the videos to tell the story, and it's not really like charts and maps, you know what I mean? But it still falls within kind of this under this visual umbrella that I think is part of what we do, and it's why I call it a visual story and not a graphic story or something, right? And do we have another example? I'm trying to remember. Oh, and then here's one we did on homeless housing. This is a type of visual story I bet you've all seen too, that we call scrolly telling, which is a terrible term, which is where as you scroll, things sort of move and happen. And this is another type of visual technique that we use from time to time, depending on whether it fits the story we're trying to tell. Okay. I think that's it for those examples. And then I think we get to thing 3, if I remember my deck right, which is digital designs. Oh no, it doesn't fit the screen size. My gosh, you found a bug in my deck. But this is a case where we're using our digital design skills to elevate the newsroom's most ambitious journalism through what we think are cool digital custom presentations. And in this case, we're usually helping to elevate stories developed by other departments rather than our own work. And a lot of it has nothing to do with data or graphics. We're kind of the boutique web designers for these flagship projects of the newsroom. Okay. So examples of that would be on the following slides. So the first one would be, we did an obituaries package of all the people who died from COVID. Not all of them, of many people who've died of COVID here locally. And then that package has sort of a custom design to try to make it more dramatic and interesting and engaging for the reader. The next example is one from Sunday. I wonder if anybody here saw it. We had a piece by Rosanna Shee about DDT being dumped off the coast back in the day here in LA. And to try to make that story more impactful and grabby and to get people, we did a custom design for it, which included a video topper, which you see here, a little scrolly telling in the middle, and then the sort of overall design and theme of the page is customized to fit the story. It isn't just the generic LA Times kind of look, right? Now, the next one is the Chicano moratorium package. Over the summer, we had an anniversary of a famous protest in East LA against the Vietnam War, which ended up being a series of stories. And in the past, this might have just been like a newspaper special section, and then a bunch of pages on our website that aren't really connected. But what we tried to do is to bring a style and theme to the whole package. This is kind of the cover page where all the stories were collected. And then each of the individual stories was given sort of a variation on the theme that you see here, is the idea. And I think next up is the one I'm going to, then sometimes we do these for other platforms, not just for the open web. The Linux nerd in me would love it all just to be on RWWW. But, you know, as far as our business goes, we do need to cross-publish these things on monopolistic corporate platforms, guys, like Apple News. And so sometimes we will customize stuff to work on those other places as well, as you see here with our voter guide, which ran inside of Apple News. And then we have, I think the next slide will just tease one we have coming. We're going to try to do a crazier year in review package that will be more visual and fun than what we typically done in the past. So those are the three types of things we do. The next section kind of gets into what that requires for a change. And some of this is a little more my message for people internally at the LA Times, but I think it'll work for you guys too, which is for our data and graphics department to make these things and to achieve this mission, they have to be more independent and ambitious than maybe a traditional graphics department has been, and they need to have a higher skill level. So that requires us to, you know, seek out and develop our own ideas, to look at the major storylines of the day, be it COVID or Kobe or the Dodgers winning or the election or the George Floyd protests or homelessness here locally or whatever those major topics are that we know both matter to our democracy, but also to our audience in terms of what they want to pay for. We need to look at those topics and say, our job is to develop striking visual and data coverage that people are going to want. And that means we have to be more ambitious than some departments have been in the past. We need to take more initiative, and we need to operate more like a traditional news department in having our own sort of editing system and people in place. So that's kind of this section. You can just jump through the next few slides and we'll get to where the next section, I just talk about the results. So just, you can jump ahead here a couple. There's Alex Tatuzzian, my deputy editor, my hero. And then the next slide is our listing. We have a job listing for a second deputy editor as we try to increase our editing muscle on our team, which is one of my major strategic goals for the current moment. And, you know, the reason we pursue all these goals is not just because we're nerds and we like to do it, which is maybe a good enough reason if, you know, you're not expecting to get paid. But, you know, we also are pursuing this different type of journalism. One, because we like doing it. Two, because it's better journalism. But three, because it pays and it's better for our business. And so the next section is really kind of covers that these types of things I've been showing you, they're more popular with audiences. They're more valuable in that they are seen to convert more new subscribers to the digital product, which is our #1 business goal, than a typical story. And they're more durable in that they continue to draw an audience long after they're initially published, where most news stories kind of peter out within a day or two. So this next section is all redacted, so we don't need to look at it, but I can give you the gist. I mean, you probably aren't going to be surprised to hear this if you think about it, but our coronavirus tracker, as humble as it may appear to you, is the most popular page in the history of the Los Angeles Times website. No page has ever been visited by more people. And if you compare it to our top traditional stories, it is multiple times more popular than the most popular stories of the year. And then when you look at conversions in terms of what's valuable in attracting new paying subscribers, it is an order of magnitude higher than the #2 story of the entire year. And so you see that when things like this connect, they have a sort of home run possibility for the business that a traditional story very rarely can have. And then if you look at that over time, you'll see that it didn't become the top converting story until 3 or 4 months after it had initially launched, which just shows that it's continuing to draw audience. And new paying customers over time, and that sort of durability I was talking about. And so for those reasons, we think that there's a strong business logic behind investing in what we do. And I'll kind of close with this, I guess, maybe, but that having been a news nerd, as people say, and having done this kind of thing for nearly 20 years now, that has been the biggest change that I have seen in the last 5 or 10 years. When I began this as like a computer programmer journalist in 2000, we were curiosities. We were either the one person on the investigative team who had learned to code to try to do a cool data analysis for a traditional print investigative piece, or you were some weird person in the corner who said the internet's going to be big one day and we need to learn how to make new weird things. And so the justifications for most of the teams that I've been on in my entire career were either this is data analysis to do more impactful and important investigative reporting. That's actually what got me into it initially and is still my passion, right? Or it was this is sort of boutique internet experimentation to like kind of see what comes of it, right? And we're now far enough into the digital transition to the information economy that that's just fundamentally changed. And what we've seen is that there are certain types of these products, these data and graphics products, that are so successful that there's now like a capitalistic economic logic for producing them. And there's less and less of a logic for producing what these departments produced before. And so that's why I think, I guess I am at the university, so I can get all Marxist on you guys, like I think that is this economic logic that is driving kind of the evolution of our team and the justification for growing it, as well as similar changes you see in other departments like ours at other news organizations, some of which are like us in the middle of the transition, and some others are further along down the road, like for instance, the New York Times graphics desk, which is already fully converted into this type of thing that I've been talking about here today. And I don't work there, so I don't know the numbers, but I would estimate based on what we see and based upon how the number of things they put out and the quality of what they put out, that like the New York Times graphics department may be the most read and most profitable department in the whole newsroom. Like that wouldn't surprise me, with maybe the exception of 1 or 2 people who write about Trump, and that is something that just was not true in the past when these departments were seen as supplementary, right? So that's my spiel. I'm happy to talk about really any of these issues that were raised, any of the stories in particular. You guys want to talk about Python, I'll talk D3, I'll talk about that. Whatever you guys want to talk about, I'm happy to just jam and hang out.
All right. Well, that was fascinating. I do certainly want to open it up to the audience because this is about the students who are here participating this week. Maybe I'll have Andy kind of summarize the questions in the chat room, but in the meantime, go ahead and post questions that you have for Ben in the chat room. But maybe I'll kick it off a little bit here, Ben. You really talk about this kind of transformative age of data journalism through this kind of visual evolution. Mm-hmm. What's just kind of like mind-boggling to me is the fluidity by which you guys go about your business. Thinking like any one of the products that you have showcased in your presentation, if we were to do any one of those in academic institution, it'll probably take 6 months to create. Mm-hmm. And I'm just kind of, befuddled by this, your ability to, pivot so quickly with a news story. And then the next day you have like something that looks like it took 6 months to create. Can you talk a little bit about this kind of this environment that you work in, the speed that you have to work in, and do you ever sleep?
Well, I'm glad you think that. During COVID, very rarely, as you can tell by looking at me. But like after this election, the dream is like December, like maybe a day off. But like, but more seriously, it's really like any, I like the factory metaphor, but I'm sure there's other ways to talk about it. But it's like any process, any like manufacturing process, you break it down into pieces and then you like get really good at like, getting each of those pieces of things that need to get done kind of like handled, and you then try to speed up the process as much as you can. And so, like in the case of like a visual story, for instance, you can think about it in that abstract manufacturing way, in the sense that you need a toolkit that lets you stand up a single static page that's outside of like a traditional rigid content management system, right? That can be custom coded and designed. And so what you'll find is that at our department and every other one like it, that people have their little quote framework or their little, publishing rig that lets them spin up a standalone web page. And then within that, there's like components of web development that make it easier for you to move quickly, like template inheritance. Well, within that system, we have a base template that has all the LA Times styles and fonts and the header and footer and like all the basic pieces. And so then those are just like there for you when you like get the page like rolling, you know what I mean? And you're within that already. And then by the push of a button, you can trigger a little deploy that will send that like blank page live. And then within the framework, depending on how you set it up, you have ways to import data files, and then to quickly get them into JavaScript and other tools so that you can lay out the page kind of as quickly as possible. And our system isn't as streamlined as it could be or as it should be, but like we've developed it ourselves internally, and we're trying to make it better like all the time. Like this week we were talking about, well, how could we get it better at producing a headless page that's for iframing in other places? How could we make a template that's just like ready to make an iframe page that could go on the homepage in 10 minutes, right? And so you have to have like that toolkit that's there. You have to have someone on staff who can like build and maintain such a toolkit because they don't really exist. One of my goals is for there to be a more standard open source sort of like thing for that. You know what I mean? You look at tool, like when we make an application like the live election results or the tracker, we might use Django or some of these pretty highly developed web frameworks for databases. But when it comes to static pages, you really just have kind of like a hodgepodge of like node framework thingies that like can kind of halfway make a page, but they don't have the 30 different things you actually need to make a real page that you want to publish, right? And like kind of, I think that there's the possibility for a stronger open source framework that goes beyond just the basic tools and gets into a little more the opinionated decisions about how to manage deployment and static assets and data files and stuff. Wow, that was way too nerdy, but like that's part of it. That's like the technology part. And then there's the kind of editing and journalism part, which is identifying either planned events that are ahead on the calendar that are coming, like the election, or pivoting when a major storyline emerges and then focusing your assignment on it. And so like in the case of like the Kobe thing, it's like Kobe's helicopter crashes on Sunday. In a breaking news situation like that, we tend to think in terms of like rounds of coverage or stages. So on day one, we're going to do this. On day two, we're going to do this. And then we're going to aim for something that's like a little more. You know what I mean? And so like in the case of Kobe, day one was just like, where is the crash? What kind of helicopter was it? You know what I mean? The basic facts, and can you visually do that? Day two was, well, let's get the play-by-play. What was the like, when did they take off? Where did they go? So we had a graphic with the day two story that had that stuff. Was their route a typical route, or was it an unusual route? And then what happens typically in that is after you learn the basic facts, you kind of get to a point where you're like, okay, here's what we think the story is. You know what I mean? So like within these facts, here's what we think is worth sort of teasing out visually for people. So both has to be something insightful that goes beyond the basic facts for people, but it also has to have like a visual component to it, right? And so in the case of Kobe, our decision was to focus on the final turns of the helicopter. All this is, of course, debatable, but those were sort of our judgments we made like in those moments. Like the Conception boat crash, the fire off Santa Barbara coast, I guess a year ago now, was another example of that, where day one, it's just, well, where was the boat? What was the boat's route? Day two, our piece for the weekend then was like, well, what were the escape routes on this boat? Where that was what seemed to us to be like the story. You're kind of betting that that's how it's going to shake out. You know what I mean? As the facts come in. And then let's make a 3D model of the boat so we can show people what these escape routes were like and emphasize that they weren't very good, is what it ended up being. So that's like a breaking news situation. And then there's kind of in between ones where it's like there's going to be this long storyline. And this is something that we're just trying to really get better at in our department this year. And is what I really admire about the New York Times and some of the more mature departments is it seems to me that they have kind of decided on for the year, here's what their major storylines are going to be. And then they come up with a string of visual coverage to try to attack those major storylines. And sometimes those can be planned, like the election. And other times, like COVID, they just occur and you have to be smart, pivot, right? And so for us, we've done that this year for the Floyd protests and for the COVID coverage, where we put together our own independent visual coverage plan of like, here's ideas. Everybody in the team pitches things in. We think about, are there applications we could do? We think about, are there visual stories we could do? And then we try to make them happen.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I just want to jump in. There's a really, really great question. I think it can kind of build on what you were, what you just talked about. But the question is about just sort of thought process in developing stories and data, but specifically about dealing with biases in storytelling. And then the follow-up to it is, are there any specific examples that you could share where you did face pushback on a story that was sort of data driven, but maybe there's some sort of part of it that that kind of, there was a stop to it?
Like internally at the LA Times? That's,
yeah.
Well,
or maybe just from you. Maybe you kind of, yeah.
I think I have an example. It might not be exactly that. I will just say I've been here 13 years and, like any institution, people have disagreements and conflicts and struggles, you know what I mean? And I've had my own. But I will say that in that time, I have never once felt that if I had a good story that I knew was true, we couldn't get it published. That's never happened. There are people I really disagree with, and to be honest with you, I don't like, and they might not like me, but I have at different times been able to come to them with, we have this story, check this out, let's do it. And those people, they rise above all the personal stuff and they're like, yeah, let's do it. You know what I mean? And to me, that's one of the great things about a newsroom is that people who disagree or who are different can unite around like a good story. And like, I have nothing but good things to say about that personally. But like this is an example though, and of something slightly different but related, which is how, and one thing I really love about statistics is how they can sometimes lead you to conclusions that you had never imagined, you know what I mean? Or maybe were counter to your initial bias. And then you end up telling a different story than the one you thought you were going to tell when it started out, right? And so you guys remember Hurricane Harvey in Houston. Oh, I have to send a Slack message really quick. I have to. This will just take a second. I have bought a mechanical keyboard during this like period at home, guys, and it is so loud when I type that this might be deafening. But you guys remember Hurricane Harvey? This was in Houston a couple years ago. They had kind of like a big storm come through and kind of flood the whole place. And it led to these sort of crazy images on television of people trying to cross the city in this sort of biblical flood kind of situation. And it was a Friday night and we were sitting in the newsroom at the LA Times, and an editor said to me, well, we got to do something. Let's come up with something. It was one of these moments, right? Like, what are we going to do? This nuts thing is happening. We have to come up with a way to cover it. And like a lot of those situations, you kind of start with what you're seeing in the news, what you hear from other people, and your own biases. You know what I mean? Like what you kind of think about the world. And like, and then we're trying to come up with a data story. And so our initial thought was, hey, if we get the data about where the FEMA flood zones are, these officially defined flood zones from the government, right? And we compare it to the early damage data that we see coming in from the government about where buildings are damaged, we're gonna find that all the people in these zones got wiped out. And we're gonna be able to add them up into some big number and try to do a story about the like extent of the damage, right? And like, we didn't know exactly what it was gonna be, but that was kind of our methodological bias or frame that we like came to it with, right? Let me just send this message, sorry. And we're all fired up to do that. I stayed up till like 1 a.m. Like, it's like, oh my gosh, the Harris County Property Assessor's Office has all the data online. Yeah, grab it. And the FEMA is having a conference call and they're gonna give out the damage data. Yeah. wow, there's property values. Here's the flood zones. I'm going to put them all together and like find it out. And then we pitch that story to an editor and we say, this is what the story's going to be. It's going to be about how screwed up Houston got because of all this. And then I did the analysis, and what I quickly found, or not quickly, not so quickly, what I soon found was that most of the damage was actually outside of the official FEMA flood zones, right? So that was an interesting thing. And then we're like, okay, so let's start calling people and let's figure out what's going on. So we're just getting on the phone, calling, texting, because we have all these addresses from the property assessor. It's just call every person and just see what's going on. And we did dozens and dozens of phone calls. And what we found is that people inside the official FEMA risk zones were actually like fine. Like every one of them we could talk to was like, no, I'm good. We were high. You know, we had put up like, we had elevated our house, or we had put in a retaining pond and that caught all the water, or our roads got redone. And it was the people outside who had the problems. And what we kind of pieced together then from talking to experts and more people was that our initial assumption was actually reverse. And that's because, believe it or not, public policy works, guys, or it can. It's that if you're inside an official FEMA flood zone, there were all these additional building requirements and retrofitting requirements for like taking care and getting ready. And so the people who lived in the quote unquote riskiest areas actually ended up having the best outcomes because they had to take all these preventive measures. And so we ended up writing a story about that, about how, hey, these regulations actually work, but they're not nearly widespread enough to save all these other people. You know what I mean? Is kind of what the story ended up being. And we had to kind of go back to the editor and be like, oh, our initial pitch, it's like not that at all. And that was this, you know, it's a little hard to summarize, but that was this sort of like weird process of gathering numbers, listening to them, talking to people on the other end of the data, and gradually having like a light bulb go on, like, oh, everything I think is wrong. And then whenever that happens, there's always this like fun meeting, like in the middle of it, where like you get together and you're like, hey, we're totally wrong, right? And you have to, okay, well, we can't just give up. We got to come up with like some story. And so then oftentimes it's a more interesting story, you know what I mean? Because it's something you didn't expect, you know?
Yeah, that is actually amazing. And it's really, I think it's just sort of really helpful to kind of get that perspective on how you develop and really work through these stories. Another question, and I know we want to be really sensitive of having you here for too long, but we have a couple of really good questions. One,
Yeah,
I think that would maybe really also be helpful for students is just sort of thinking about that tipping point between when you're creating a story, when is it interactive and when is it static? And kind of like how does that decision process get made, and how does that sort of how does that happen?
That's a tough one. And there's not one answer, but I mean, if the question is when is something interactive, like if you ask it that way, the answer is less and less so every month and year. And that has a lot to do with the changes we've seen in consumer technology over the last 5 or 10 years. As more and more people have moved to mobile phones, believe it or not, you probably will believe it, you guys are into tech. The majority of people who read the LA Times online read it on a phone, like, you know, well more than 50%. And so in a circumstance where the majority of your audience is visiting you on a very small screen, which they mostly just like thumb up and down on, right? A lot of the interactive graphics that were very intricate and made in Adobe Flash or whatever, you know, 10 years ago, really no longer makes sense because most people aren't going to interact with them and use them. And the reality is what we learned from web analytics, even before the mobile change, is that most people never interacted with them anyway. And so that's why you've seen a shift if you followed kind of our little niche, you've seen a shift away from most interactive graphics. And so for the most part, we're looking for graphics that can work static and small on mobile. And the way to make them more insightful is usually through adding an annotation layer, you know, so like a little swoopy arrow or something, or a scrolling change like you see in that scrollytelling technique where the chart sort of changes as the user continues to read the page. Where interactivity still makes a lot of sense, I think, is in cases of personalization or of discovery. So, you know, we're going to have a chart that shows you the total number of deaths at nursing homes from COVID, But then when we're going to have a table that lets you look up the nursing home you care about, right? And then that table should have like a search and a filter and a way for you to like dig into it. And then there's something like the live wildfires map, which is really about, one, giving you an overview of like how many fires are there right now, but then two, letting you drill down into areas that you care about to see kind of the latest data within those areas. And so that's the map being there for personalization and discovery, you know. I think a lot of the interactivity that was just like about fiddling, you've probably noticed has like mostly disappeared. Plus it takes more time to code.
Yeah, very cool. You know, we definitely want to ask you this one question for sure, because we have so many students here who are interested in data and storytelling.
Yeah.
And sort of what is, like, if you had one piece of advice for students going out, working on school projects, or really just wanting to break into LA Times newsroom or other places, what is it? What should they know?
One piece of advice? I mean,
Or
I don't
two,
know
or three.
I could give you a couple.
Yeah,
like,
please.
I mean, to me, this is a thing that has become cliche and is said by some people who I think are kind of jerks. But if you erase them from your mind, it is true. You got to learn to code. You know what I mean? It's just like, to really do this well, you have to learn to code. And you have to learn to code certain types of things, not just like coding in general. But I do think the fundamentals of programming are so important. The fundamentals of just like software and package design are really underrated. Just like, how do I write a function and then import it into another file and then reuse it, and like package code, like the basics of coding, I think are super important. And then the sort of applied application of coding to the types of things we do. And so that, I think, on the one hand, is kind of data gathering and analysis, you know, so this is, you know, how do I get data by scraping it or reading it out of a database or building my own database? And then how do I analyze it to like interview the data, is how we think about it. What questions do I have for the data, and how can I write code that will help me get the answers to those questions? And so the tool that I teach a lot of classes on that I like, but it's all debatable, is the Jupyter Notebook with Python data analysis tools. They're free, is kind of the best thing about it. And the Jupyter environment, once you figure out how to get it running, is just a really handy way to do like step-by-step kind of data work. And then on the other side, there's the sort of, how do we tell stories visually through web development, right? And that really involves learning fundamentals of HTML and CSS. You know, again, just the basics are so important. They're not even, in HTML's case, it's not even that hard, right? And then how you use JavaScript to make interactivity and data visualizations. I'm a big fan of D3, and it's also a great way to get better at JavaScript too, because the D3 culture is really built around excellence in programming, which I think is important. I think there's a lot of free tools that are just about cutting corners that don't really help you over the long run to master that type of thing. So to me, there's the coding part, but then there's the journalism part, which is thing two. And this is where, like when I get applicants for internships and stuff from data science programs, which I'm always glad to get and I love to see, you know, sometimes the people just haven't had the time or opportunity to really apply their work in a way that they're making something for the general public, or that has kind of a headline takeaway like point. You know, a big part of editing and putting out a piece of journalism is you kind of have to have like something to say. And just writing a notebook that asks 10 questions of the data, or just making a graphic that lets you fiddle with the numbers, isn't enough, right? The things that you're making need to kind of take that next level of kind of journalistic whatever, you know, by saying, my finding is this, and here's the headline that says it, and here's the 3 charts that show it. You know what I mean? And you kind of like have a takeaway and a point so that you have something to share. And so when I see applicants who, and I don't expect anyone who's bidding out to really have mastered any of this, but when I see people who kind of have clearly put in the effort to do both of those two things, to like learn how to do the coding stuff to make stuff, but also learn how to boil it down and to make something out of it for regular people, you know what I mean? That's when I think you're a strong applicant and you're sort of beginning the road to do what we do. But the reality is learning how to code takes a while, and the things we're trying to do are emerging and experimental. And so no one, including myself, really gets kind of good at what we're doing until they've spent a couple years really apprenticing at it. And that's just being human, you know?
That's great. That's really humbling, and I think really honest to share that. And I hope all the students out there really get a lot out of that. That's really helpful. Yo, I don't know if you wanted to kind of have a wrap up question or.
Yeah, whatever you guys got, I'll take them. I got a couple
Yeah.
minutes yet. Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for kind of validating this week for us from what you just said, the value of coding, open data. This is all that we've been kind of preaching in the last couple of days. Also should mention that if I look up visual storyteller in the dictionary, I think I'll find you in there. You seem to embody that kind of visual storyteller mentality. But I don't know if there's like one or two final questions. Maybe somebody can unmute themselves if you're out there and introduce yourself to Ben and ask a question. Hoping somebody can do that.
I have a quick question.
Please.
And that's about, Ben, I see that you're active in an organization called Data for Progress. And I'm wondering if you'd talk about that a little bit. It sort of ties in with what we've been doing with humanitarian mapping and sort of how you see, that kind of mission converging with what you're doing at the LA Times, which is obviously more of a commercial venture.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm familiar with Data for Progress, but I'm guessing it came up linked to some other things that I do. You know what I mean? But like, for me personally, open source software is, probably as close as I get to religion. But like, and I think is a really underrated as a solution to a lot of problems. It just needs more institutional support from places like UCLA, but which you guys are providing today, which is great, but like, and so I've been involved in a number of kind of open source data gathering and cleaning efforts related to helping journalists both improve their skills, but also to kind of build software and data infrastructure so we're not all like replicating each other's work and we can benefit from kind of group collaboration. One of those is called the California Civic Data Coalition. And so this was a foundation funded open source software project that refines and cleans up the campaign finance data put up by the California state governments. This is the money in our state politics, like all these Uber ads you're seeing for Prop 22 right now. And the data is there. It's just really difficult to access because it's just in crappy shape. And so there's kind of like this problem of who's going to clean it up, right? And so we created an open source group to write the software that would be the refinery for that like raw data. And then all the code and all the effort is open source as well as the result. Along the way, we invented some bulk data loading open source software tools, which people now use for like totally different purposes. You know what I mean? There's like side benefits to doing that. And we're replicating that model currently when it comes to tracking COVID data, where initially the LA Times was doing 100% of this COVID tracking ourselves in California. But we now have a team of people from 8 newsrooms across the state who are helping us kind of gather it and consolidate this cleaned up database of COVID data. And I think that there's one, a lot of potential for that, but two, I think as news organizations get smaller and struggle, I don't know if there's a better alternative, like who, you know what I mean? Other than we just hope the New York Times gets big enough, they can do it for everybody. You know what I mean? Like that's really, the commercial solution is going to be a news monopoly, that's just big enough to do that is what I think. But, maybe I'm being too pessimistic. So I think we need to band together to come up with this alternative.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. How about one last question for Ben? How about one of
I have a question.
Oh, here we go.
Please.
So I love your neighborhood map, which is I know, which has been on the page for a while now. It's so great. And I use it in my classes to talk to instruct students about two things. One, about the concept of place, and another about the concept of volunteer geographic information.
Mhm.
And I'm curious if you guys have done other projects that you think are within the realm of like volunteer geographic information. So like people actually map, like
Yep.
users map.
That project is one of my great white whales, and that we haven't really revived it. The plan was to do it last year for this census, but other things have come up.
Cool.
And just so people know, there is no official source of neighborhoods in LA County, even though we all feel that we live in one. And so about 10 years ago with some of my colleagues, we sort of tried to poll the public and then divide up LA County into, the LA Times neighborhoods at least. And then we connected those kind of like with the Legos of census tracts. So then all the areas have all this metadata about the demographics that are then merged with them, which has allowed us to do dozens of investigative and analytical stories to compare East LA to West LA. You know what I mean? Not more in social science. And one of my personal ambitions is for our team to be more of a social science data provider. We're trying to do that a little bit here with COVID, but I would love to sort of be able to publish sort of like the machine readable atlas of LA demographics by neighborhood or something, so that we could see more and more people able to do that type of analytical work. But at the core of it was this crowdsourcing effort, because we didn't want to do it entirely alone. So we sort of put out our own version of the maps, and then we had people tell us how wrong we were and we modified them. And you can't please everybody, and there's definitely flaws, but that was kind of a collaborative process. That's the type of thing that we haven't turned into like it. We're going to do something like that every month, but there's a few examples through the years that I've had a lot of fun working on. Like we finally were going to do a few years ago, what is the East Side story in the LA Times, you know what I mean? Where everybody brings out their grievances, and I will tell you, as long as I am the data and graphics editor, the East Side begins at the LA River. I'm sorry, everybody who lives on Sunset, you don't live on the East Side. Sorry. You know what I mean? But but we know people disagree. You know what I mean? Like there is no answer. And so we did like a one-off that was sort of in that same tradition, where it was, here's a map of LA, draw the East Side, right? And we had hundreds of people like draw them all. And then we made this composite map that was like everybody's East Side like overlaid. And it was a little abstract and arty, you know what I mean? I don't know if it was like the clearest data visualization ever drawn, but it sort of had this fun effort of like, here's the splatter of like what everybody thinks, and though I'm sure our readership is biased in a certain direction. But so like that was an example of that, I guess.
Yeah.
To me, the crowdsourcing thing that's out there that nobody does much with Viz, which we could do with QuakeBot, is the like, did you feel it earthquake data from like USGS? I think is like always there for every earthquake, and like nobody really does much with it. I know the scientists at USGS do, but like, I don't know if the news media does. Yeah.
Right. Cool. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, no, there's a whole bunch of chatter about that project you're talking about, mapping Los Angeles neighborhoods. Many of us fondly remember that kind of, hey, we can contribute to defining boundaries, which is not something we're used to. Boundaries are usually defined by somebody up there, and we abide by those boundaries. And here's the LA Times saying, hey, you define your own boundaries. So that was a really neat project. And still to this day, in the urban planning department, that's a go-to resource for doing neighborhood level analysis. So
yeah, I was absolutely just going to say that. I mean, I think the impact of that project in the classroom, I just don't know if that kind of reaches you all, but like, I mean, that is in so many different classes, so many different students use that as sort of like understanding LA at this point. Yes, we have census tracts. Yes, we have these other boundaries, but those particular boundaries in that work is just super, super influential in the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I just see all the times we failed to revive it. So I feel a little guilty when you tell me that, but like, we kind of I have some ideas. My view, like, this is one of these things where like internally it gets caught up in the politics of like, do we need a hyper local neighborhood news product? You know what I mean? And like, it's hard to have a conversation internally without it being caught up with like traditional coverage. It's my belief that it should be more of a data application and like kind of like a social science hub that is like easy enough for the average person to understand. You know what I mean? That's just like, what is, Cheviot Hills or whatever, you know? And I would like to kind of narrow kind of the mission of it to really focus on that kind of popularizing the demographics thing. And so my hope is that we can do that when the new census data comes out. But as you know, it's the ACS is where the action really is, so it doesn't matter. I kind of wonder if we could partner that with, like, can I give you my pet idea and you guys can tell me if it's terrible? With like a gentrification analysis.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
if you like that, yeah. Because I did some reading, and you guys may know this better than me, but there's these like academic definitions of gentrification, which, as far as I can tell, are kind of limited to a sort of post-war redevelopment sort of framework of like, how old is the housing stock and how recently has it been replenished and what is the change in housing value been, right? And so like, I look at those methods and I can take these longitudinal census databases and I can do that for every census tract. And then I could tell you what's the most gentrified neighborhood in LA, like that way, right? That would be one way. But like my hunch is that that's not enough, that like in our 21st century life, there's sort of this Brooklynized idea of gentrification, which has to do with cultural products, right? And commerce and like that kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like, what is the business in Highland Park now on that strip on Fig versus 10 years ago, right? Used to be a Latino typewriter shop, and now it's a hipster cocktail bar or whatever, you know? And I think that's what people have in mind when they say gentrification today. And so like, what I'm kind of reaching for is, could you come up with a metric that would try to capture that and then integrate it with the older metrics into like a kind of more up-to-date gentrification index or something? Does anybody have any ideas or have read anything that's miles ahead of me on this?
well, you know, there's a Center for Neighborhood Knowledge here at UCLA that does a lot of research. I don't know if you know Paul Wong. He's a professor who
I don't know.
Paul Wong worked with models of gentrification, and they have a site, a project called Urban Displacement, collaboration with Berkeley and UCLA, where they have indexes for gentrification.
No,
I mean,
really.
it just talks about the need for us, you know, in academia, and also to let you know, like UCLA is launching this kind of Data X initiative. So it sounds like we are one step behind you guys, but we're right there in terms of our efforts to think about, like you said, you know, the importance of coding in kind of the more social sciences, which isn't traditionally been the case. So just to think about how us in academia, I mean, I feel such a stronger bond with you through what we've been discussing today, and the importance that we work together to create some meaningful, you know, stories that can inform policy decisions across our communities. So
yeah, I also love, I really love the idea of kind of looking at sort of alternative data sources. I was on a call yesterday and a workshop yesterday actually looking at the Getty's new Richer project.
Yeah, I saw
and they're
that,
putting
yeah.
and they're putting all these images out there. And this workshop was really trying to understand how to look at those images, you know, in this you know, cultural production, the streets that were photographed, historically looking at, you know, racial change over time, and really talking about gentrification and how a data set like that with those images could be used with, you know, all these sources that you're talking about, but other data sets that are cultural, and kind of trying to, you know, look at that, and also how to sort of code those images and doing that coding so that it actually is you know, doing the work that we want it to do in terms of understanding you know, the displacement or whatever's happening, and not just sort of saying like, oh, you know, this was here before and now it's gone, but like, well, why is it gone? And really kind of, you know, putting the point onto that. So yeah, it's really interesting. And I think you're right. I mean, I think what we've been talking about with, you know, really learning how to you know, build coding and you know, and also just stepping back and being able to kind of piece, I think, like really different data sets. And the thing that we were talking about yesterday too is just sort of understanding that world of data, and kind of, especially I think for things like gentrification, kind of stepping out and kind of looking at or trying to understand it in a way that's local, and trying to find sources that maybe aren't that typical, census, way of understanding it. So I don't know. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a guy at Harvard I found, he did a paper where he used Yelp data, and then he tried to like correlate the arrival of certain types of businesses with other gentrification indicators, like educated population or whatever. And so there might be something there, but I kind of imagine the index. You take like the traditional metric of like buildings or whatever, you add in the racial dynamic of, white invasion, as I've learned it's called in some papers. And then you maybe add like a third cultural dimension of these products. And then you like mix those into like a radar chart or like an index or something. And that'd be kind of cool. My bet is West Adams would be number one. That's my bet, guys.
I would say from personal experience of living in both Brooklyn and here in LA, the first major indicator should be when your real estate agent decides to change the name of the neighborhood.
There you go. That's another one.
That is your indicator.
One thing I learned looking at the literature too, I thought was interesting, is traditionally only like the lowest quartile could ever be thought of as having gentrified. So you had to be depressed to ever undergo the process. And I don't think that people think about it that way today anymore. Like, because when I ran the traditional numbers, I saw that Venice Beach had a really high score on some of the values, but wouldn't have been considered because it was already a pretty wealthy place to begin with, right? And so like, there's this way in which I think the traditional numeric framework doesn't mesh with how people really think about it or talk about it today. And like, that's the thing I just feel like there must be some way to wrestle down. But
that could be and this is a very geographically nerdy, but a modifiable aerial unit problem issue where, because you're looking at Venice as a whole.
Right, we've predefined it.
Like,
yeah.
The very wealthy parts get, averaged with the less wealthy parts. So those.
That's a good point.
Yeah. But I'm thinking also that with the sort of combining what Andy was talking about with the coding and like maybe taking for each neighborhood, choosing kind of like the commercial strip and looking at Google Street View and sort of like coding that over time for the main drags of different neighborhoods.
Yeah, or even if we did the number for the whole county, you could pick the place that had the highest numeric score and then go in and do that closer study on that place or something, and then you wouldn't have to do everywhere.
Right.
I also have to think about how to do less, sorry.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that's one of the things that we all struggle to is sort of kind of, looking at LA, but I think a lot of us push our students and just people that we work with to focus in on areas. And I think that's sort of like a nice bridge to, I think what you at the Times do journalistically is kind of putting in the person into our data stories and like, not always sort of like having that bird's eye view of everybody, but like, let's zoom in. Let's like really kind of understand what this data set is doing on this street, on this block. So
we talk about them as like, there's like two different couples we're looking for. There's either Mr. and Mrs. Outlier, or there's Mr. and Mrs. Central Tendency. And like, kind of depending on like which story you're telling, you're sort of like aiming for those people,
That's great. I love that.
I feel like we're in a newsroom right now making decisions for the next story. But I want to wrap us up here, taking too much of your time. Thank you so much. The conversations in the chat room has been just nonstop. You've touched a lot of topics that really mean so much to many of us. So just want to say a big thank you to Ben. I'm sure it's shared by all of us here. There you go. And Ben, let's definitely get together again when there's a little bit more time to relax. I don't know when that would be, but I'd love to kind of have a conversation about how we in academia can work closely together with you guys at the LA Times.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for
Thank you.
listening.
Thank you for being so generous with your time. It's really amazing.
Thank you so much.
Sorry I was late.
If it means anything, I love the new look. I love the
Oh,
The
well,
punk
I'm going to
Ben.
report that to my wife.
All right. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you,
Right,
Ben.
thank you. Mhm.
Bye.